and non Morbigal. I'm thrilled to introduce our first keynote speaker for the conference, Patrick Brouder. And he was formerly at Braga University and is now a researcher at Vancouver Island University in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, and a senior research fellow in the School of Tourism and Hospitality at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. He serves as chair of the Economic Geography Group of the Canadian Association of Geographers and on the steering committee of the International Polar Tourism Research Network. He is a research editor for Tourism Geographies Journal and an editorial board member for Polar Geography Journal. He is the co-editor of Tourism Destination Evolution, an edited volume bringing together economic geography and tourism studies. And we were thrilled. And he's a member of the Advisory Council for CREATOUR. Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'd like to thank the CREATOUR team and Nancy for letting me join this very interesting project. I'd like to thank Paula and the local team here for looking after me, and especially Sylvia, who did all the back and forth with me via email to get me here. I'd also like to thank the city of Braga for welcoming me with such perfect Irish weather, so happy about that. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things today. Nancy mentioned the book, the research agenda for creative tourism. I'm going to dip in and out a little bit of my chapter in that, just to make sure that I do, as the professor said earlier, deliver some of the teaching moments, hopefully to some of you. So dip in and out of the chapter to make sure we cover a little bit of that. I'm also going to share two stories from my research career so far. One from where I spent most of my time, a place that's very dear to me, Jokkmokk in Sweden. So I'll come to that, and I'll share another story of new work that I'm trying to develop in British Columbia. A much shorter story near the end. I will also try to cover, in order to do that, to get through all of that, I'll be looking at creative tourism, but not directly at creative tourism. So as Nancy mentioned, I'm a geographer by training, and I should say when I usually speak at tourism conferences, I say that I'm a tourism researcher who doesn't care about tourists, or who doesn't care even necessarily about tourism. I'm a tourism researcher who cares about the communities that are engaged, and tourism is one outlet for those communities to continue and to sustain and to be resilient going forward. So focus on the communities. But to make sure I cover some of the creative tourism parts too, I'll also have a special guest speaker who I brought with me, who doesn't appear in your program, but who's going to come and speak for 10 minutes at the end, somebody who herself is a creator, and somebody who, well, we can also add that and say she's a tourist. She's here in Braga today, so I'll be inviting Tyra later. But just a preamble first, based on my chapter in Nancy's book on creative tourism in what I call creative outposts, and I'll come to that. So in our 21st century urbanizing world, there's a tendency to reserve words like creative, innovative for the most geographically central places, the big cities with high populations and high-tech sectors. So this is reflected in most of the research when you look at innovation or even creativity, creative industries literature, the Richard Florida stuff, which focuses on the low-hanging fruit of creativity in mega cities, for example. And they have a lot of creativity to be studied. However, through tourism studies, we have a window on another kind of creativity in another kind of place. And the CREATOUR project here in Portugal is leading the way in developing and showcasing this creative tourism in small cities and rural areas. Looking from the outside into the CREATOUR project, just to give you some context as an outsider, this is cutting edge stuff on the academic side that hasn't really caught up yet. So we're like struggling to get there and say, well, what more can we learn about creative tourism? And here in Portugal, you have a nationally spread out project that's already starting to look at that. So you're already ahead of the curve. So well done on that. So looking beyond that to the small cities and rural areas, as CREATOUR does. Many rural peripheral communities have a strong tradition of innovation as they thrived on entrepreneurial activity to develop their natural resources and agricultural land. And often in unforgiving environments. And other peripheral communities, something that's very important to my research, have been home to indigenous peoples for countless generations. And these groups have lived with the land by displaying incredible resourcefulness. So we know there's innovation, we know there's creativity, a lot going on in the rural areas. And of course they have problems too. One thing when you're a geographer, especially when we speak at tourism conferences, we have to be a little bit careful that we don't talk too much about the problems, because there's also opportunities, but we get it out the way at the beginning. The problems are, as we know across Europe, multiple blows to social cohesion, aging communities, depopulating, declining government revenues, etc. But tourism development is one way in which rural peripheral regions can stem the tide of their decline and prosper once more. We know that. Government agencies from local to supranational endorse tourism as a way to advance the peripheral economic development. So our job is to see how can we do that as good as possible, and ultimately, from my perspective, for the benefit of the communities. So this is a little bit of the presentation, and the title in the program, I believe, is Rural Resilience Through Tenacious Tourism. And then I just added a subtitle, which is the title of my chapter in Nancy's book, Creative Tourism in Creative Outposts. And I'll tell you what a creative outpost is later. I should just acknowledge quickly, say I'm starting at Vancouver Island University very soon, so a new affiliation different to Brock University. I have to thank the people at Brock University and the Canadian federal government's Banting postdoctoral fellowships, because they paid for a good share of the research that I talk about today, and also to the European Tourism Research Institute at Mid-Sweden University in the north of Sweden, which was a big part in getting my PhD completed through funding. So, a little bit very quickly about me. I'm Irish. Left Ireland to move to Sweden to do a PhD over 10 years ago, I guess. My PhD was in the north of Sweden. I'll come to that, working in the Arctic community of Jokkmokk mostly. I left Sweden and moved to Canada because my wife is Canadian and she dragged me to Canada, and I had to look for something to do, so I did a postdoc in Niagara. And so Niagara, you all know, a huge mass tourism destination, 15 million plus tourists every year in an area with just under 500,000 people. Big tourism, but not much studied on the rural area. So we went there and said, hey, you have all of this tourism, how come it's not being diffused and spread out to the rural areas? So we started to look at that. First time anyone had done that with research, first time any of the applied local stakeholders had seen researchers come and ask them, what are you doing in your small area? So that kind of inspires what I've been doing for the last few years. I'm about to start a research chair position at Vancouver Island University in BC. And as Nancy mentioned, I also do research with South Africa, and it's something of a Portuguese connection with Mozambique also. So, and this is my donkey in Ireland. Just there was a lot of talk about the donkeys here on the table. This is my donkey in Ireland, just to let you know. So I really appreciate the donkey theme here also on stage. That's a little bit about my past and something on my present, but here's my immediate future. Right after I leave this conference, I go to another conference that I'm co-organizing in the Yukon, and just put this here to give you some context of what I'm interested in, the type of research that I've been doing at the community level. So we have the International Polar Tourism Research Network meets every 2 years. Our next meeting is the end of June in Yukon, Canada. Creative forces in the polar region. So very similar themes to what you're looking at here. And a huge thanks to the pilot projects yesterday. So much inspiration for me, even though it was in Portuguese, a very steep learning curve for me, but so much inspiration to take back to the colleagues in Yukon from some of the really, really good networking and collaboration that you're doing right here. But the type of stuff we'll be doing, just to give you some idea, some of our workshops will be local language use in tourism settings, supporting the development and revitalization of indigenous languages in Canada through community-centric initiatives. Artists, very relevant for here, artists, community building and the opportunities of tourism, and something very special, we're going to do a collaboration with the Nakai Theatre in Whitehorse, and our conference attendees who will be doing a host and guests in polar places, creating theatre together on the spot, potentially in the forest. We haven't decided yet. Okay. So back to the creative tourism development. As you know, Richards and Wilson, Greg Richards, part of the project here, have listed the indicators of creative tourism development, including increased activity and increased creativity and creative activities among locals, growth in tolerance towards those from outside the locale, and greater social cohesion in the community. And of course, they list this in their research as indicators of creative development, but we could also say, while they're legitimate indicators, they're also desirable outcomes in their own right. And tourism is one sector which allows this development to occur. So we often see these as indicators, but not to forget that if we have these in our communities, we have nicer communities, better communities. So how do we get to there? And when I come to later in the presentation, how do we measure that? How do we go back to our government officials who support our communities through funding And how do we say to them, look, we have increased social cohesion, we are better than we were before. How do we tell that? That's something for the project. Okay, but on to a little bit on, I think I said, well, what is a creative outpost? So this is a map of the north of Sweden. I'm not sure if you can see it too well, but Jokkmokk village, where I did most of my research, is a small village. The village has about 3,500 people, and the municipality, which is the second largest municipality in all of Sweden, huge municipality, only has 5,000 people. So we're talking about an island of a village and then almost nothing else around it. So it's right on the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle cuts right across here. And for the geographers in the room, if you're wondering why I don't have the Arctic Circle on the map, it's because we know that the Arctic Circle actually moves up and moves down a little bit over 20,000 year cycle. So no need for that. What you can see here is the outline. I don't know how well you can see, but there's an outline of the municipality, and then there's a layer over it. And this layer is very important when we talk about cultural or creative tourism. That's the layer of the World Heritage Area, Laponia, which is preserved for one of the few World Heritage areas that has dual designation for nature. The nature is the glaciated landscape from the last great ice age, and most importantly from the culture, which is the Sami indigenous people who live in the north of Sweden. So Jokkmokk, according to my research, is what I call here in the title or subtitle, a creative outpost. But for you, what is a creative outpost? A creative outpost is a rural, peripheral community which faces a challenging socioeconomic environment, but which meets its challenges by deploying endogenous, so locally homegrown, creative capital, resulting in a palpable shift towards a more sustainable socioeconomic environment. And the word palpable is very important there, because when it comes to measurement or indicators, how do we know how much we've moved, when we've moved to a better place than where we were before? When we go to the communities, it's the same in Portugal. When you go to a community that is thriving through tourism, you can feel it. You can see it around you. Even if you can't say we have 300 new jobs, 200 new jobs, you go down deeper, you feel it when you're in a place that has good social cohesion. So some common characteristics of creative outposts include a history of economic dependence on the outside capital, often from the national capital. In the case of Jokkmokk, it would be, of course, Stockholm, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away. They also often had, you have this outside capital, but also you have a local subsistence economy. And that's something that you can see along maybe the Atlantic coast of Ireland, for example, and probably also here in the Atlantic coast of Portugal, where you had a subsistence economy as well as an outside influence. A socioeconomic trajectory perceived as being in perpetual decline, often with a negative outlook. So when we talk about some of our rural places, we're too negative, but actually that's not the case, because there may also be a noticeable presence of persistent local attempts over time. Keep trying. What can we do? What's the new EU project that we can be part of? How can we do this? And in this case, it's creative tourism. And sometimes they have an island-like status. In the case of Jokkmokk, 3,500 people, and then almost no one around until you get to the big city, Luleå, on the coast, which big city is about 45,000, 50,000 people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of Jokkmokk and what happened there in the last few years, and hopefully that tells us some idea of how we can go forward with sort of creative tourism development and some of the challenges we face when we try to do it, because they have had some success. Just a little bit of context on the theory then, the tourism development, tourism as a part of community economic development rather than as an end in itself. And I think I've made that clear from earlier from my own perspective. Community economic development requires diversity. So diversity, and this is something we come to when we talk about creative tourism, how narrow or how broad you want to define creative tourism. Because many different development paths may prove resilient over the long term. And the reason I put tourism in brackets here is because one of the challenges we have with tourism is that we tend to think in terms of tourism, but what are the other industries that are going on around it? That's why it was interesting yesterday, one of the presentations on the creative industrial tourism, which taps into those industries and then makes the tourism product out of them, which was something that Jokkmokk has tried to do a little bit too. And why is it important? It may change over the long term. And the laggards today, so those that are a little bit behind, they may be the leaders tomorrow. In Jokkmokk, tourism had always been seen as a laggard. You didn't want to be in tourism. And the easy way to describe this, we usually say, 20 years ago, if you told someone I am an entrepreneur in Yukmuk, they would have looked at you a little bit funny. If you had said, I am a tourism entrepreneur, they would have kept away from you as much as they could 20 years ago. So it was seen as a little bit outsider. Now, if you say I'm a tourism entrepreneur in Yukmuk, you are the cutting edge of development in the municipality. And that's how it can change over time. So tourism now a leader. So a little bit about what Yukmuk is doing is that they're moving from a situation of, when it comes to tourism development, moving from coping to creating. Coping with all those challenges of being a northern peripheral community, to now creating and deciding how are we going to go forward, how are we going to take all of the opportunities that are there for us. This is Yukmuk. If you speak any Germanic language, you can probably tell what time of year this photo was taken. So Christmas time, God Yule means happy Christmas. You might struggle a bit more to know what time of day this was taken. So I'm not sure how good the picture is from where you're seeing it, but quite dark, but taken at midday. So 12 p.m. in the middle of the day, you're on the Arctic Circle. The sun doesn't come above the horizon for the period around 21st of December. But it's in here. Here's the tourist office of Yukmuk, small tourist office in a rather nice building. Just to go back to the theory a little bit, how does Yukmuk come into this? Anderson, some years ago, 2000, in the Journal of Rural Studies, labeled the innovation of entrepreneurs who created novel worth out of seemingly low-value resources. He called this the paradox in the periphery. And in his research, he asked, why is it that often outsiders come into our rural peripheral areas and they see something, and they see value in something that sometimes the locals hadn't seen before? That's something that in the case of Yukmuk is very common. Just to put it simply, maybe 80 or so tourism entrepreneurs in the village or in the municipality, maybe 40 are not from Yukmuk, not from Sweden, they're from Central Europe, so similar to what you have here in Portugal. You'd have Germans, Austrians, Dutch coming up there, and a few English making a name for it. But for some reason they come in and see value where maybe some of the locals hadn't seen it before. How do we get that together? But back to the coping. Coping is a regionally specific form of resilience, so the word coping, managing, surviving, coping. I'd like to say regionally specific form of resilience as it more accurately relates the challenging environment which rural peripheral communities have been facing over the years. And Jürgen Ole Bernhold wrote a whole book called Coping with Distance, which is just about this, how do rural peripheral communities do that. But it also better captures the ongoing processes of dealing with such an environment, such a difficult environment. The increase of in the case of Yukmuk, and similar in Western Ireland and similar in Portugal, I'm sure, the increase of tourists seeking out kind of last wilderness, where's the place where they haven't been, or some distant cultural heritage that they haven't seen or experienced, alongside the locals who are seeking new endogenous development opportunities, has created new ways of coping for our rural areas. So that's why it's important for us to tap into that and do it. A little bit then just to go into the story of Yukmuk. Very similar, very related to what's going on in Portugal in terms of EU funding is a big part of tourism development. We all know that. The problem with EU funding is it's like almost always 3-year projects, and that can be a problem. This is, just to give you some context of Yukmuk, very important, this is like a Sami indigenous man at the Yukmuk market, which is a winter market that takes place end of January, start of February every year. It's been going on for over 400 years. Again, this is an example that 15, 20 years ago, the Yukmuk market was a little bit of a tourist attraction, maybe for some young people who go from the cities to go check it out. It wasn't a major tourist attraction until about 5-8 years ago. They had their 400-year anniversary and decided to make a push with the tourism effort. And now it's probably the single biggest festival in the north of Sweden. Definitely when you go away from the coast, it's the biggest. So it's changed again slowly over time, with the indigenous Sami culture at the center of that, but not the only part of it. Other forms of tourism, nature-based tourism being a big part of it. But to get into the story of how they got to where they are now with better tourism than they had even 10 years ago, we have to go back into this European Union project. So 2011, they were awarded an EU project to develop a new DMO, Destination Marketing Organization. or destination management organization, I guess, depending on your perspective. But so they got this money, 2011. They tried to figure out what to do with it in 2012, and then they knew once we start this in 1st of January 2013, we have 3 years to deliver, because that's the problem with the EU project. You get the money, you start up, you're in the middle of it, and you realize, oh no, the end is coming. Where's the next money coming from? They had this exact problem. This is Thomas Brandloff, he came in 2013 as the CEO of the new DMO, so Destination Yokmok. We're going to promote it, we're going to develop tourism, try to work with the local companies. This guy is amazing. He really good marketing brain, really amazing ideas. I'll show you a quick example if I can, if I'm doing okay for time. Yeah, maybe a very quick example in a minute. But he had great marketing ideas, and I wish I got a better picture of him, because you can see his eyes are closed. but he quit after a few months. So he had amazing marketing ideas, but he ran into the problem that his vision, his idea, wasn't what the locals wanted. So he had the skills, but didn't have the local alignment. Just a very quick example, I'll just shoot through this, of one thing he had that was amazing. This is a Japanese brand of fancy biscuits, very expensive, called Yokomoku. It's Yokmok. So they took their name for this from the village where this guy was working. So he thought, we need to aim for the Japanese tourism market. Because the person who invented this company had visited in the 1970s Yokmok as a young man, and he liked the name, he liked the place, so he took the name back and started a successful company. That's what you do in Japan. So he did that. Problem was, Thomas's success in his few months with the DMO, he doubled the number of Japanese tourists visiting Yokmok. They went from 7 to 14. So it was a good idea, a lot of investment. He had to fly to Japan, of course, for this, but in the end, it wasn't the low-hanging fruit that they were looking for. Who was their market? Who wanted to actually come to Yokmok? The problem that Yokmok has is that most Swedish people, 9 million Swedish people, most Swedish people haven't visited it, this amazing cultural center in the north on the Arctic. So they rely on getting in the outsiders. But maybe the Japanese were the wrong way to go because of distance decay effects and other interesting geography things. Okay, so Thomas got replaced. Remember, we're in the middle of a 3-year project. Thomas goes away, we have to find someone to replace him. They pulled in this happy chap here, Per Olof. They pulled him in, PO we'll call him. PO came in from the municipality, and they sent him in and said, you take over and do your best with this. He himself said, a little bit like me, I don't care about tourism, I don't know about tourism, but what can we do to make this work for the businesses that we have? Talk to the businesses, work with them, develop with them. And something happened in that period. So I go back to there was maybe 80 tourism entrepreneurs in Yokmok. About 60 of them were part of the new DMO. They paid to join as co-owners. When he came in at that stage, there was maybe about 30 of them who were 40, again, so a little bit of attrition, who were still interested and still wanted to be involved. What he realized is that the nature-based ones, many of them from Austria and Germany, they didn't really feel the need to connect locally because their entire market base was coming directly on planes from Germany, for example, right in and landing in the nearby airport and going straight to them. So they just didn't feel the need. As a small business, you only have so much time. Why would you engage? The one niche area within the 30 that they found that was super community engaged, that wanted Yokmok to succeed, not tourism to succeed, was the creative and cultural sector. They were the ones who wanted to get involved. So he just said, okay, I'll do what I can to support you as much as I can. He would want me to make clear, he wasn't the one driving this, he was just facilitating the space and helping them get where they needed to be. I don't have time to talk about this guy, he's the tallest man in Yokmok. There's me for context, he's a good bit taller than me. If we have time in the questions or whatever, we could maybe, or later in the conference, we could probably talk about this, but the reason I bring him in here very quickly is the definition of creative tourism. Where do we go with it? What do we mean by creative tourism? How limiting should it be? This guy organized from scratch a race, the Northern Shields Loppet, which is a cross-country skiing race. It was a historic one that happened, a couple of 100 years ago. He restarted it and turned it into the most successful sporting event in the north of Sweden. He did it in 1 year, and now it's gone for 3 years in a row. This man is incredible. Austrian, by the way, so he came in, did something that has had a huge impact. During the race, about 300 competitors each year, and about 1,000 people staying in the village for a week or 2 weeks in some cases. Don't have time to talk about him, but I wanted to include him here because how do we figure around creative tourism when we have the other innovative people in the villages and in the areas who are not necessarily working with the creative sector. How do we involve them? But back to specifically, because what we're interested in here is some notices from Jokkmokk on creative industries, and I think they're both in Swedish, so I have to just run through them for you quickly. You can see some of the words: be inspired, get inspired. Samverka means cooperate, work together, and within creative and Näringer's industries. So creative industries. So what they're saying here is they have this creative talks, Sápmi, which is the land of the Sami people, which runs all across the northern countries of Europe. Why this is interesting and why I included here is because these are creative talks that they bring people to that involve people who are doing handcrafts, for one thing, but they also involve people who are doing reindeer farming, who use the meat in some way that fits into the culinary sector. So they're bringing people who are, like yesterday, at the creative industrial level, to those that are very, very nano-tourism, as you mentioned yesterday, working one person. Bringing them together to talk and say, how can we drive Jokkmokk together? The second important point is that it's not just tourism here, it's the other industries in the village too. How do we fit creative tourism in with the other industries? Because endogenous development is not only tourism development. Okay. And this other one was just, I put this in here because it is hosted by it's a handcraft exhibit. A new kind of cool handcraft exhibit. So they've always had the Sami handcrafts, but now they try to make them a little bit more current, a little bit more modern, integrated with some new people rather than just the old traditional crafts. They try to bring them together, and the place they bring them together is the Aiche, which is the Museum of Northern Sweden in the village of Jokkmokk. It's always been a great tourism resource, but like many museums, it had the problem that it somehow at some point it stagnated, and it stayed the same as it was from the 1970s, early 80s. This stagnated in terms of the tourism point of view. Of course, they were doing lots of other important museum work. Now, for the last 5 or 10 years, as they've reconnected with the new DMO, they start to find, we're doing new stuff together. So bring life back to the museum too. And all of this happening towards the end of the 3-year funding of the EU project. So now what do we do? We're out of money. Who's going to pay for tourism development? Who's going to keep supporting this? In the case of Jokkmokk, for the year 2017 and now into 2018, the municipality said, okay, we'll keep it going for now. They're doing the funding because they see there some results, but they can't necessarily do the funding forever because they're a small municipality. So, one more quick story from Jokkmokk, and then I move on past that. This hotel in the background, again, picture taken about 2 p.m. in the middle of the day, in the middle of winter. Used to be called Hotel this side, and then down this side it used to say Gestes, which means the guests hotel or something like that. The family that run it, the Åkerlund family, you can see their name here, they had run it for generations, and the guy who was there when I was there, very nice chef, but getting old, wanted to retire, and the plan was to close this and to turn it into accommodation for refugees, so from East Africa mostly, were coming to Sweden, and maybe some Syrians. The people in Jokkmokk, interestingly, opposed this. They didn't want to have this hotel, which is in the middle of the town, turn into a refugee center. Not because they were not in favor of the refugees. They said, well, we'll use this other building. But because they said, if we lose this hotel, we lose tourism. It disappears, because this is one of only 2 hotels. So they said, we want the refugees, but we have to do something. What did they do? Back to PO and the destination Jokkmokk, their tourist office, they said, what can we do? They got together, they had no plans. 2 of the women decided, we're going to buy the hotel. And okay, they had to get a loan, like we heard yesterday, how to access the finance. They got some support from the municipality to access the loan, co-signing or whatever, but they bought the hotel, completely redesigned it. I don't have time to go into all like how beautiful, like make it like you can imagine Scandinavian design points inside the hotel, changing it. And but more importantly for us, they connected then to the Sami design. So the hotel to the Sami craft center, which is just down the road, and actively linked them together so that everyone who's coming through the hotel now is more likely to be involved with or more likely to engage with the cultural sector locally. So just a quick example of how the problems we face when somebody retires in a hotel or somebody with competence retires, and then what happens? We either lose that or we reinvigorate it. But some lessons from the story of Jokkmokk, the 3-year EU funding project that they went through, which became a 6-year EU locally funded project. Tourism as entrepreneurship in the north of Sweden, for sure, is relatively new. Business survival is difficult. This is just taken from other research. We know this from general business research. About 20% of new small businesses that start will survive for the long term. A little bit depressing if you're starting a new business, but that's the reality. Project survival at the EU level, for example, is also difficult. And we have this sort of what I call here a 3-year trauma, because you get the funding, you get some energy, you're in the middle of it like you guys are now with the CREATOUR, and then well, what's going to happen next year? We have to report and legitimize ourselves for the future. And that's a challenge for sure. But the projects, but to be a positive as I come towards the end of this now, the projects do leave some legacy. So my research in Jokkmokk was over 10 years, still ongoing now. And then we had a couple of researchers working there before, Professor Dieter Muller being the biggest one, the most engaged, looking at it for the 10 or 15 years before that. So what we do know with the projects is it can be a little bit depressing if your project becomes a report on a shelf after 3 years in somebody's office and never heard of again. But what we know in the case of Jokkmokk, the ladies that started this hotel, the 3-year project that these guys were part of, that was not their first project with the municipality. They had gone through 3 projects before, 3 EU projects, and they had gone through frustration and failure. And it wasn't until over 10 years later that they managed to get the one thing lined up with the timing of somebody else retiring from their hotel that made it work for them. That gave them the opportunity to actually do what they want to do. So it takes time, you have to keep going. So the projects do leave some legacy. And within the research, how do we measure that? Might be a good question. Well, of course, the entrepreneurs are the key people. They're the ones leading the local innovation. So for researchers, how can we support what they're doing? And in the case of Jokkmokk, I titled this Tenacious Tourism. I say tenacious because the tourism hangs on and keeps going as a local development opportunity when other things go up and down. Other industries in the north of Sweden, mining being the big one, up and down, up and down. But tourism manages to hang on and develop slowly over time. So tenacious, and at the moment in Jokkmokk, it's not just tenacious, but it's thriving. Tried to link now a little bit as I come the last few minutes from my time in Sweden to my time in Canada. Just to clarify for you guys, this is Sweden, this is Canada, she's Canadian, she's Australian, she's Austrian-Australian, and he's Australian, he's Swedish, and this is, of course, a Sami Swedish man. Just to give you a little bit of context to where you can go with creative tourism, you never know where it's going to go. This guy has always been a Sami reindeer herder. That's his main job. He takes care of the reindeer. But since the tourism has started to develop in the north of Sweden, he's gotten into talking about his story, talking about his heritage, talking about how they build the temporary huts out when they're on the land with the reindeer. I tried to think in euros. He spends one day, like one full day, so morning to evening, with groups of tourists. And in how many euros do you think he gets paid for one day at his premium rate for sharing his cultural tourism, creative tourism? He gets 10,000 for one day, 10,000 euros. Okay, so in his case, and this doesn't apply to everyone, of course, in Portugal, in his case, it's a very unique, special culture. Many places have that, but he's working a lot with corporate clients who come up from Stockholm and they want to be out on the land. Occasionally it involves a helicopter. It almost always involves a 4-wheel scooter. But the point here is that it's cultural tourism. You don't know, we discussed this with some people yesterday, you don't know how much your cultural tourism is worth when you're pricing it until you reach the upper limit of that pricing. And it's hard to know that. Okay, some things are very competitive in pricing and some things are unique. Something to bear in mind. The reason I include British Columbia, I'm now moving towards British Columbia, and you see that now with the developments we see in British Columbia, especially in indigenous tourism, where the price of the product goes up and up and up and up, where a few years ago it was almost like a stop and see type thing. Now it's experience, and the experience is worth a lot more. Okay, so I'm going to move now just the last couple of slides to talk about a little bit, this is a little bit more research focused for the researchers in the room and for the CREATOUR project, and how can we get better at what we're doing and how can we understand where we're going for the next 3-year project, if I dare say that. Okay, creative tourism and rural resilience. So you mentioned a little bit, Nancy, with the creative tourism 2.0, and from your notes that you had, this is from your notes, now shifting towards a more extensive relationship between tourism and the creative industries. And I'm not happy. What about Creative Tourism 3.0? We haven't even got to 2.0 yet, but what about 3.0? So some of the things going forward from my experience in northern Sweden, what might be happening. Will it be about creative processes rather than just the industries? So the engagement, the process, what we're doing, so you're not just the sectoral focused or industry focused. And if I'm a community member who has no creative industry skills, how can I join in those new developments? So lots of the excellent pilots yesterday talked about the role of the community and the tourism, the heritage, the creativity, and the locals. But one of the things we have in that is the bubble of, there are often arts, culture, and we definitely have this in Yukon, the arts and culture bubble. So the people who are involved in that, they're not all of the local community. So as we bring more and more tourists into our local communities, how do we make sure that we're not leaving the rest of our locals behind, or how can we fit them into the projects going forward? I don't know. Just to finish with the final short story on Ashcroft. So now we've moved to British Columbia. So that was my big Yukmuk story, EU project type thing, but very short story. So British Columbia, the westernmost province in Canada, just to give you some context, just under 5 million people live in BC, and we get about 5 million overnight stays per year. So I'll give you some international tours. You know the destinations, the famous ones. You've definitely heard of Vancouver, and you've probably heard of Whistler, the big skiing resort. So the two major destinations. We also have a wine region. But I don't want to talk about all that. I want to talk about the other end of the scale, the very, very small villages like Ashcroft. This is especially for you, Kathleen, Ashcroft, very close to where you're from. So Ashcroft is a village of about 1,600 people. And I think it has shown tremendous resilience in utilizing the local assets that it has to develop alternate economic possibilities. It was a gold rush town in the 1800s, and then it was on the highway for a long time. Then they built an alternate highway. They took a lot of the traffic away. It was just off the highway. They took a lot of the traffic away, and now they're sort of, a typical rural community with not a whole lot happening on the day-to-day basis. But of particular note, as you can see if you've had a chance to read this, and funnily that it ties in with Humberto yesterday, mosaics. They have a local strong art scene in this small village that has gone around the town and done cool things. So I'll just show you one example of this, and then I'll try to wrap up. So this is what I call Ashcroft's community-first approach to development. Bear in mind now that this is not a major tourism centre, and it's not a major tourism focus. The first goal here is community. The tourism and other development side is part of it. So they have a bunch of artists, as you saw on the last slide, who do glass mosaics, and they got together. This scene, which is in the background of this picture, was where the Chinese labourers who were involved in building the railway in Canada, it was a burial ground for those that died during the building. A few years ago, I think you probably have to go back 5-10 years ago, 10 years ago I guess, it was sort of neglected, this site, and grown over, weeds, everything else. It was unmarked and you wouldn't know it was there. The locals decided we can't have that. They came in, cleared it out. Now they built an altar, a memorial altar for those people. They built a memorial plaque saying that they were the workers here, the Chinese labourers that we brought in. And then the most recent part, along with other glass mosaics that they were doing around town, they did this glass mosaic to commemorate that. Ashcroft doesn't get too many tourists, but the tourists who come to Ashcroft now know that not only do they have amazing local artists, but that those artists care about their history and their heritage, and they want to share that. The potential for this going forward, if you compare where Yukmuk is today, a lot of tourism, with somewhere smaller that doesn't have that much tourism. I put it in here as an example because you never know where you're going to go. And sometimes these things become huge successes, and sometimes they just fizzle out over time. But the question is, where is Ashcroft going to go? And I'm optimistic for them. Just a couple of last points to get onto some future research ideas for creative tourism. This is my own research program at the moment. Tourism for community economic development and rural sustainability. Tourism can play an important role in rural sustainability and community economic development. But all too often we put the cart before the horse, or the cart before the burro in this case, and pursue tourism development rather than community development through tourism. So how can we rethink that a little bit for those of us that that's relevant for? Tourism Forward moves the emphasis from the sector of tourism and back to the community. So the tourism is for the community. So tourism being a means to an end. And that's what I'll be working on for the next 5 years if you're interested in talking to me more about that. In rural tourism, we know that small is beautiful. We know that already. How do we work around that? So this is very specific for the researchers maybe. This is a winery in, Kathleen?
The Okanagan?
Actually, in Kamloops.
Oh, is that?
Yeah, this is Sagewood.
Oh,
Sagewood, very smallest winery, I believe. This is his whole shack that he does most of the sales out of in British Columbia. But small is beautiful. So tourism not traditionally associated with creativity. Even the brand new paper that came out on tourism by Anna Mette Hjeliger and her colleagues that came out this year in the Scandinavian Journal of Tourism still talked about when you look at tourism at the macro level, not creative, not innovative. That disappears when you put a geographical lens in that and go down to the local level. We see that disappear completely. Very innovative, very creative, very collaborative. And the business sector is very innovative. We're just bad at measuring it. So come back to what I talked about earlier, the palpable feeling when you go to a place like Jokkmokk, how do we measure that and share that to show our funders and everyone else that this community is managing and how to support that? From the academic point of view, tourism is all about DUI. So we usually think of innovation, science, technology innovation. This is the other stream of innovation research, using, interacting. Lots of literature on that if you're thinking, how can we do this better? How can we understand what we're doing better? How can we get better metrics or indicators for creative tourism going forward? DUI leads to coevolution. Coevolution I haven't talked about too much. Don't have time to do it right now, but in my book on tourism destination evolution, it's a big thing. How does the local tourism sector co-evolve with the others, like I talked about in the case of Jokkmokk, with the other sectors, with the municipal government, with the planners, and with the local community too. So how will we measure success? That's a question for CREATOUR. And the final research considerations. One thing to consider, it was pointed out this morning that the great thing about CREATOUR is spread out, dispersed all across the whole country, except for the islands, the Azores and Madeira. But the concentration of tourism supply in rural peripheral places, most of the research says that that's expected to consolidate. If you look at how the businesses evolve over time, they become more, the ones that are further away get a little bit left behind and they tend to disappear, and the ones that are in the villages, even if the village is not big, if it's like Ashcroft, 1,500, Jokkmokk, 3,500, it's the villages where you see the activity and the action as we study the business evolution over the long term. Maybe it's less of an issue in Portugal, I don't know, but it's something to think about. The metrics we use to measure the innovation, the creativity, so innovation, need to be developed with the long term in mind, because we can't look at this in what's going to happen in a 3-year project, but where are we going to be 10 years from now? Looking beyond the product and the project failures, and I put failures in inverted commas because Thomas, who I talked about earlier, he wasn't a failure. He quit as the head of the DMO and started a local tourism business, an accommodation business that's very, very, very successful. He just wasn't right for the DMO role. So looking beyond failures and timelines to the lessons learned. So what can we take from the one project and take that into the next one going forward so that we're constantly evolving up and up and up, slowly, incremental over time. Thank you for listening. And I did promise, so we're pretty good on the timing then, I did promise a special guest, because I do feel when I present, it's a little bit removed. As I said, I'm not a creative tourism guy, but I work a lot with the communities. So I thought, why not bring a special guest who is a creator, who is a maker? And I'd like to invite, you can introduce yourself, the wonderful Tyra Wheatman-Sowat, who is a Canadian everything. So, Tyra, welcome. This one, or you can use this if you want.
Okay.
This is like forward.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, CREATOUR, for having me. My name is, So my name is Tyra Wheatman-Sowat. I'm a fashion designer by trade. I am a traveler, and I am an Instagram enthusiast. So my talk is just going to be about Instagram, how I use it as a maker, and how I use it as a tourist, and how I use it as a creative tourist. I love Instagram for so many reasons. I'm a visual person. I can use it quickly to keep myself connected to what my friends and family are doing. I get inspired by businesses that what's going on here? And so, yeah, I wanted to unpack that a little bit. I broke it down into sort of what I'm calling the 3 C's of Instagram that I love, which are cataloging, connecting, and collaboration. So, yeah, a little bit about my history. I studied fashion design in Vancouver. I'm actually originally from a northern British Columbia town who has, my town's industry, like Patrick was talking about, actually declined, and my city has actually had to build itself up through tourism, which has taken a long time, and it has a bit of a balance of new industry and tourism, which is really interesting. I won't talk about that, but I thought that was interesting. I currently actually live in Koblenz, Germany. I'm a freelance designer, a stylist, a motivational coach, and I'm actually starting my own fashion line. So, when I first started using Instagram, I started using it with my business that I was working with Devil May Wear to connect to our out-of-town guests. Our clients, we produce everything locally. My boss still continues to produce everything by hand, which meant that there was a lot of one-of-a-kind items. There was a lot of items coming in that we like to say fresh off the press, and to inform our guests, our clients about it, we would post on Instagram what was coming through, what was in our stores, so if they were out of town, they could keep in touch with that, and also so our clients could then make the choice to make the trip down to our stores. So, continuing on, and talking about how I like to use Instagram. When I first started using Instagram personally, I was just sort of posting willy-nilly. I was like, I like photos, I like to connect, and so I'm just going to post this, I'm going to post that. But I wasn't really considering what my focus was, and sort of I didn't really know why I was doing it until actually about, I would say maybe a year ago, when I decided, I want to launch this fashion line. I should then challenge myself and practice what I can do, what Instagram can actually do for me as a person. Therefore, when I go to implement it with my business and my own marketing, I'll already have sort of experimented, and as we know, entrepreneurship is all about figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So one of the things I thought about to get me started was just simply using it as a catalog. So for me, you can see I'm really into fashion, so I post a lot of my outfits. I'm really into sewing, so I like to do some of my processes. As a business, you could use this as a way to add value to your clients before they come to you, to give them an experience, to show them what you're about. So if you are a teacher, you could do little micro lessons, because Instagram gives you about 1 minute to post a video. You can post multiple videos, but you could do this is what we're doing in the workshop, this is a recipe I'm working on, this is a project I'm considering. I love it because it shows you not only what you're doing, but it shows people what you're doing. And it also kind of gives this more human side to the business. It doesn't have to be clean and perfect. It can be a little messy. And I think people want to see that side of you. Also, I have, you can tell, I have sort of I'm chilling at my favorite cafe and stuff like that. I also here do shout outs of products and stuff like that to help, to showcase the things that I love. And that sort of brings me to my next part, is connection. So I love to use Instagram to connect. I use it to find my peers. Right now I'm working and living in Koblenz, and there's not really a great fashion scene in Koblenz. There is people who are doing fashion, but it's not like Vancouver. You know, Vancouver, you walk down the street and you're going to meet someone in the fashion industry. You're going to meet those creatives. Instagram gives me a way to not only connect back to the people that I know in Vancouver and keep in touch with what they're doing, but it also gets me to keep in touch with what's happening in, say, Cologne, in Berlin, and around the world. I follow businesses across the world, and as I said, I'm doing my own fashion business, so I've been searching and talking with different businesses and seeing what they're doing and connecting with that. As a tourist, I love to use Instagram to really connect to a place. I love it because you can use, well, like I said, you can connect to the different businesses, you can talk directly to the businesses, you can comment and tell them what you like, they can reply to you right away, and you can, with the use of hashtags, which if you aren't sure what a hashtag is, it's essentially a tag that you can put at the bottom of your post, which then organizes all the posts underneath the hashtag. So you can kind of leave your digital mark, so to say, on a place. Yes. And there's this sort of constant connection and direct and information exchange when it comes to Instagram that I love. People will send each other, you know, funny videos, businesses that they like, connect each other with friends. For instance, I'm taking a break from my regular style posts and sewing posts, and I'm posting stuff about me being here in Portugal. And I had a friend be like, "Oh, you're in Portugal. My friend was just in Portugal. She was here at this place. If you have time, you should go and check it out." Unfortunately, I won't have time to check it out, but I'm looking forward to that. So through connection, and you can come to my next favorite thing, which is collaboration, which I think is so important. And so it's so important and so fun. You can collaborate not only with who's around you physically in your town, but you can collaborate with people across the globe. You can collaborate with people who are within your own project through the use of, you know, seeing what they're doing, and by seeing what they're doing, you can see how you can help them, how they can help you. This picture here is a night that we started on Granville Island, which is a shopping district, an artist shopping district in Vancouver, where we decided to have a little fun and mix pottery with textiles to do some cross-pollination there. So we did a little talk about, we had 2 designers, and we did a theme with the pottery. This one I think is black and white, and so we invited the people then to come down and to talk about their pottery and their textiles, to do that kind of cross-pollination. Another way that people collaborate with Instagram is doing Instagram takeovers, which is you invite someone to come into invite someone to take over your Instagram to show their experience with you, and so that will bring in, the potential is to bring in, you know, their users to you as well. Yeah, I love it. What I've seen for me when I started using Instagram with more intention to, when I decided to use Instagram with more intention to really focus on my sewing and my my processes and things like that, I noticed more following, which I thought was really interesting. And oh, okay. So I will just quickly then, so I'm pretty much done, but I just wanted to sort of make the point that Instagram is a free resource to use. It's a really great way to connect, collaborate, and to catalog what you're doing, to showcase the experiences that you can provide with people. You can share your skills. And to be perfectly frank, I think, you know, some people think that Instagram is useful in the city and it's just something that cities and people who are hip and trendy use, but I think if there's anywhere that actually needs to be put on the digital map and could really use this resource, it's rural areas where there isn't so much of that. We know our city's the best, we know what we love about them, and using Instagram to showcase what we love about them to draw people in is a great resource. Thank you. We're dressed the same, we should Instagram that.
We can get you, we should have her on Instagram, create one.
Yeah.
Start the term. Okay, we'll just say, okay, thank you both for very different and also both very inspiring beginnings, both from a research and practice base. And Tyra is now, as she mentioned, based in Germany in a small town.
It's like
Small
100,000
city.
people.
Small city, and is well placed to bring groups of other creatives from Europe or around the world actually to Portugal to experience some of the creative tourism offers that are emerging. We have a break scheduled, but I wanted to give us an opportunity for, I've been told, one question. Quickly, if you have any burning questions of either of these two, and then we have a break, and Tyra will be away today. She's off traveling more, but Patrick will be with us till the end of the conference, so corner him with all of your questions going forward. So does anyone have first hand up wins?